So we're going to continue on with our theme and go now to the City of Bozeman and look at what the City of Bozeman is looking at doing in regards to aquatic resource protection. So today we have Shawn Kohtz. He is the City of Bozeman's Utilities Director, and he manages everything water, wastewater, and stormwater related to the City of Bozeman, or related for the City of Bozeman. He has a BS in civil engineering and an MS in environmental engineering, and he has worked in Montana since 2015. Prior to that, he worked as a consulting engineer specializing in water resource and water quality issues throughout the Northwest. John?
Thank you for having me today. So today just wanted to talk through what City of Bozeman is doing in terms of wetlands protections, especially in light of the Sackett decision. So brief outline of what I'll talk about today. I'll review the current wetland requirements in the City of Bozeman. We haven't updated our ordinances yet, but we're working on doing that. Talk briefly about the Sackett case and how that's impacting the city. Local wetlands mitigation option that we're very fortunate to be working on and coming up to speed on now. And then lastly, talk about some of the upcoming changes that we're working on, but we haven't adopted yet. So, Bozeman has quite a few strategic plan priorities, which is the why we're doing this. We're looking at watershed management, climate change adaptation, mitigation, parks, trails, and open space and habitat. So this focus on wetlands protection really serves all of these strategic plan goals for the city. So if we really start with where we're at now and where we're going, so of course, we have the Corps of Engineers requirements for wetlands protections, but the city supplements those protections with our development code. So we've got specific development code requirements, and these code requirements largely mirror what the Corps is doing, but there are a few differences, and I'll talk about those. But first, we're trying to avoid wetlands impacts altogether, so we build that into our development review process. Where we can't avoid impacts altogether, then we're minimizing those impacts to the extent possible. So I'll give a quick example of that. We've got a development that has to build a local street, and typically we've got a 60-foot wide local street section, including right-of-way, sidewalks, boulevard space, all that. Now, this particular road is plowing right through the middle of a wetland, and unfortunately, it's a connection we absolutely have to have, but we said, okay, let's shrink up our road section, our lane widths, eliminate our parking lanes through that road section, pull our sidewalks in right up against the road. So we've got curb walks with no boulevard space in that particular case, so that we can limit impacts to wetlands. So that's an example of a scenario where we still have to have the wetlands impact, unfortunately, but we're trying to minimize that. And then lastly, where we are impacting wetlands, how do we mitigate those impacts in the city? So our local development code, I won't go, of course, through all the Corps of Engineers requirements that I think everybody's familiar with in the room, but where we've got some differences with the City of Bozeman requirements are that we regulate isolated wetlands that are not connected to waters of the United States. And then similar to John's talk earlier, one of the big protections that we have built into our development code is setting up watercourse setbacks. And we have varying watercourse setbacks throughout the city, depending on the size of the creek or the river. So those range anywhere from about 50-foot setback to 100-foot setback. And then if there is a wetland that is connected to that setback, the setback extends even farther to the edge of the wetland. So that is something that we do with our development code now, and we have done for years. So historically, a pre-Sackett decision, the city's regulations had a large amount of overlap really with the Corps work, and so we've relied heavily on the Corps of Engineers to provide the permitting, all those elements, the mitigation elements. But now with the Sackett decision, that's changing. And so I'll talk about what we're trying to do with our code to react to that and make up some of that gap. A couple of highlights in the city's code. We do not regulate stormwater facilities or irrigation ditches as wetlands. And then the way we enforce our wetlands code now is our city planning division manages 2 wetlands consultants, and then those wetlands consultants look at our code and then they apply um, specific conditions on developments as they go through the application process. So switching briefly to the Sackett case, of course, everybody's familiar with that case, I think, in this room, so I won't go into that detail. But of course, the effect of that is that it's reduced the amount of protected wetlands, in and around the city of Bozeman. So we had a consultant team look at this, and I literally just got this last night, so I'm not fully up to speed on this yet, but we had a consultant team look at all of the wetlands and potential wetlands within the city growth boundary and try to determine, okay, what is a Corps of Engineers jurisdictional wetland? What is an isolated wetland? How much overlap is there? And so this is a graphic of that, but the numbers are really interesting. So the total wetlands within the city of Bozeman growth boundary are about 1,600 acres, according to this analysis. The total acreage that our consultant team had determined is federally jurisdictional is about 1,300 acres. So that leaves about 324 acres of isolated wetlands that really fall now in the city's jurisdictional development code to try to protect and regulate. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how we do that, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But in the past, more of that was lumped into the Corps' jurisdiction. So the pie chart there, you can basically see now we've got about 20% of those pre-Sackett wetlands that now are not covered post-Sackett. To focus in on the waterways a little bit, we've got about 254 miles of waterways. We're estimating about 250 of those are City of Bozeman and Corps jurisdictional, with about 4 of those waterways solely within City of Bozeman jurisdiction. So our consultant team gave me this list of assumptions that went into that analysis, and that was to first of all, look at, what was the estimate of the federal jurisdictional waterways within the Bozeman growth boundary, and all the waterways that are connected to navigable water were considered WOTUS for this analysis. The waterways that start and end in uplands were not considered WOTUS. And then the map waterways that lack the bed and bank are not considered WOTUS as well. So from a simplistic way of looking at this, the estimate of the federal jurisdiction of wetlands is about, all wetlands within 25 feet of a WOTUS waterway were considered basically abutting the WOTUS and therefore jurisdictional. And then pre-Sackett, the estimate was that about anything within 50 feet of a WOTUS was assumed jurisdictional wetland. So that gives you a simplistic sense of the analysis for this case. So of course, now we've got this regulatory gap between pre-post-Sackett condition and the city saying, okay, how can we protect those wetlands that were once protected? So let's talk about what the city's doing from a local wetlands mitigation option. In this case, we're very fortunate to have a local partner in the Sacagawea Audubon Society because they're developing the Wetlands Mitigation Bank. And there's been a lot of discussion in the community to say, okay, we don't want to ship our Wetlands Mitigation Bank credits outside of the watershed. We'd really like those benefits to be focused in the local watershed. So Rich in the room is part of the team that is working on this, but the design for this wetland system is about 90% complete. There's about 4 years of projected mitigation bank capacity, at least at the city's current growth rate, and use of bank credits. And they're working on their USACE authorization for that wetlands mitigation bank now. And this is just a brief photo of of what that wetlands will look like when it's completed. So we've got the challenge now of, again, how do we protect these wetlands that are no longer protected post-Sackett? And it's, it largely is coming down to how do we mitigate wetlands, that are regulated by both the Corps and the city, and then those wetlands that are regulated only by the city. So, first and foremost, we really would like to see this local bank get off the ground, because it allows us to keep those bank credits in the local watershed. When we first approached our city commission with this challenge, the city commission told us, well, we'd really like to prioritize how that mitigation happens. And so they gave us initial direction that said, okay, if a developer can come in and mitigate wetlands on their site, that would be our highest priority. And then go to a local mitigation bank. But then as we work with the Corps, the Corps said, well, hold on, we've got, some questions on that, because if you look at our 2008 mitigation rule, there's a conflict there, and there's very good reasons for that mitigation rule. So for example, what we've discovered was that a lot of that on-site mitigation work that had been done in the past by developers didn't hold up to the test of time. Like, it wasn't maintained well. They weren't successful in the long term. So there are reasons really not to maybe necessarily focus on that on-site work, but use a mitigation bank where those long-term protections are in place. So we're still working on that piece. So I would say that's something that we've got some work to do with our city commission on. Of course, I think all of us are dealing with this challenge a little bit, and that is the jurisdictional determinations associated with the federal rule guidance in 2023. It's still a little bit murky on exactly what is jurisdictional wetlands and what is not. So we're trying to find that line, and that's part of the reason we had our consultant team look at this guidance and say, okay, what is actually jurisdictional wetland within the city and what is not. And that helps our development team set requirements for development. So, one of the questions that we have in developing this program is, do we take on a lot of the functions that the Corps is doing for these non-jurisdictional wetlands, and so that means, do we take on and build the staffing in the program to do permitting, mitigation, tracking, all these elements that the Corps currently does. And we haven't got to a decision on this. This is still a decision that's yet to be made by the city commission. But I think there's still a lot of potential for overlap with what the Corps is doing. So when we looked at initial estimates of building this program, building the staffing and the programming, it looked like we'd have to spend about $300,000 a year to protect those, that 300 acres of wetlands, and do all the permitting associated with that. So got a little bit of a staffing challenge there, and we'll see if that's something the city commission wants to prioritize. In the meantime, we continue to enforce our code as it exists today, and that is, there still impacts to isolated wetlands. That is non-jurisdictional wetlands, but the city still regulates. And so if there are impacts to those wetlands, we're still telling the developer, you have to mitigate for those. You have to buy the mitigation bank credits in Twin Bridges currently, at least until we've got a local bank up and running. But again, this theme has really come up over and over again in the community to say, we don't want that mitigation to go outside of our watershed. We really want to focus that in here. So there's a big priority, I would say, in our ordinance work to say, okay, if there is a local mitigation bank option, developer, or even for city projects, we've got to use that local mitigation bank first before we would ship that out to another bank such as Twin Bridges. So next steps that we're working on currently, one is modifications to our development code. So we're drafting that now. We've got several consultants working on that in addition to our internal city team. Once we've got a draft of that, we'll be doing a significant community outreach push and then discussing drafts with our various city boards and then ultimately our city commission for adoption. I'd say if I had to make a guess, we're probably 9 months to a year out before we'd be ready to adopt a ordinance change. But yeah, again, just trying to target that gap between pre and post SACA condition, as well as bring mitigation into the local watershed. And it's a picture of the wetlands that's under development for local mitigation bank. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you, Shawn. Do we have any questions? No post-lunch stupor. Bryce.
I apologize because I walked in partway through your talk, but I'm curious about Senate Bill 382 and the planning that's required under that and how wetlands are being addressed within that.
Yeah, and it's
That's the Land Use Planning Act, sorry.
yeah, certainly. So there's a big community outreach element of SB 382, and that's part of what we'll do, because if you look at 382, it talks about kind of these sub-plans, and this would more or less act as a sub-plan to say, okay, you've got these sensitive lands. If you impact those, how are we gonna deal with those? And so we've got to go through the public process to say how we're going to deal with those. Once that public process is done and we've got the planning and the ordinance in place, that addresses the 382 requirement essentially. So if we didn't have that planning done in advance of adopting the ordinance, for example, effectively you'd have to look at each development on a case-by-case basis, and each development would have to go to the city commission for that particular issue and how you mitigated those wetlands. And so it's really important to do all of that upfront planning work so it's in your planning documents, and everybody knows the playbook essentially to address the Senate Bill 382.
I do have one, and maybe it's more technical, or maybe Rich, who's been involved with the mitigation bank, might be able to answer. But if Bozeman is looking to require mitigation and buying mitigation credits from the local bank, how are you working with CORE on that? Because the debits and credits might kind of be a nightmare for the CORE and the city and the bank itself to sort of work out, and that, so that we're not essentially double dipping by selling the same credit twice.
Yeah, great question. And we have that exact same question, and we've been very fortunate to have some great partners in the CORE. Nathan Green and Sage have helped us, review some of the early drafts of our ordinance that we put together. Again, it's not adopted yet, but we've had some discussions around that early drafting. But my understanding, and I'm not an expert in that mitigation process, so bear with me, but my understanding is the RIBITS program can account for that. So we don't get into that scenario where we double count. If there's a local credit that's been sold for an isolated wetlands mitigation that the city regulates, it would still be accounted for, when somebody goes to try to buy core regulated credits. So I think that RIBITS system does take that into account.
Yes, it's the same, so Executive Order 11990. Executive Order 11990 for protection of wetlands, and federal entities are required to mitigate for all impacts. And so above and beyond what we would require for our permitting.
Emerald.
My question is, you guys are working with at least 320 so acres of wetland. Has the city actually tried to think of using parts of the Gallatin Jefferson or the other river as possible mitigation areas, or do you guys looking in kind mitigation?
You know, I think there's a lot of room for that. So one of the challenges that we've got is how do we really incentivize more mitigation within the watershed? And by the watershed, I say, you know, fairly broad area. I think that could incorporate the Gallatin, for example. You know, right now we're fortunate to have the Sacagawea Audubon Society developing, you know, their wetlands mitigation bank. But, you know, as I noted before, there's estimate of about 4 years worth of credits in that bank. And then we don't have another bank to follow that. So, you know, it really pushes you into the question of, you know, from a city standpoint, do we develop our own mitigation bank? Do you use a cash and lieu program to try to develop that locally? I don't think we've really figured that out yet, but that's part of the discussion to say, you know, how far out do we want to look at from a watershed basis to invest, you know, mitigation bank dollars or cash and lieu dollars? It's a good question. It's not one we figured out yet.
Shawn, I'm Larry Urban from the Montana Department of Transportation, doing wetland mitigation statewide. Have you guys thought out of any wetlands that you would like to preserve or protect within the city of Bozeman that you need to purchase because they're under private ownership that you could potentially use as a bank in the future?
Yes and no. So when I say yes, I mean we're largely doing that through our development code because our development code is saying first and foremost protect those wetlands. So when a subdivision application comes in, we're saying, okay, prioritize protecting those wetlands. And so we're not necessarily buying the wetlands in that case to protect them. We're just saying as part of our base code that, you know, the private landowner's got to do that. Now, there are some cases where it's not possible. You know, like I said, with, you know, kind of the example of having to get a road connection across a wetland, we may not be protecting the wetland in that particular case. I would say there's ongoing discussion about doing something along those lines, just because we do need to develop that local bank to really meet that goal of bringing those wetland mitigation credits into our local watershed. But we've not figured out that program yet. We're right in the midst of that. So that's going to take some time. And of course, the cost of land isn't, you know, helping in that discussion. That's pretty expensive down there. So yeah.
Hello, I'm Kina. I have a question. So you said that you have 4 years worth of banking that you have capacity for, wetland banking at the Sacagawea. Why do you have, what makes you say 4 years? Is it the size or is it the rate of development, or how did you guys come up with the 4 years?
Yeah, and I actually might rely on Rich a little bit to help.
I should have asked you this at lunch. Sorry, Rich.
But yeah, and that's something that the Sacagawea Audubon Society design team has given us information on. So I can't speak to the details real well, other than that's what, you know, the number that they've told us, comparing that to the pace of purchase of credits in another bank. So if our growth rate continues at its current rate, then it's about 4 years, and of course, who knows how that changes over the short-term future.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're proposing to use functional units using the MWAM to determine those. And so we're creating a functional lift at the bank compared to what's existing. And that number of credits based on the previous 10 years, the burn rate of wetlands, or purchase rate, I should say, of wetland credits at the Twin Bridges Bank is how we calculated that. And it's not a perfect calculation by any means. So but that was the best we could do it, to kind of calculate that lifespan. And it's short, but there is a real, as Shawn has mentioned, a very strong group of people in Bozeman that are really wanting to offset the local impacts locally. So.
Any? Yes.
Hi, I'm Maren. This isn't a wetland question, but it's a question about ditches. So, I mean, it looks to me like ditches are being significantly affected by development. And I could see on the map, I could see ditches highlighted in red in the map. Those must be ones that are connected to the Gallatin watershed. And so do you know why Bozeman doesn't include ditches in regulation? Because it seems like it would affect local surface and groundwater resources and probably should be considered.
Yeah, and it's primarily to protect the agricultural rights on the ditches, and that is the ditch maintenance that needs to happen, to be able to, clear out the sediments in the ditches, that types of things, making sure those are open for irrigation use. But that's the primary reason we don't include those in the City of Bozeman protections.
Okay, thank you.
Any final questions? So this is more maybe a comment that can help. Does everyone know where the Twin Bridges mitigation bank is? I hear no, I hear yes. Does someone want to describe how far you have to travel down the Gallatin and up the Jefferson and whatever other rivers to actually mitigate for impacts to Bozeman? Okay, so as the crow flies 90 miles. I guess the best way I can think of it is from Bozeman, you would travel down the East Gallatin to the Gallatin to Three Forks and then up the Jefferson. And you continue up the Jefferson to Twin Bridges to the Beaverhead. Is that right? Do I have my rivers right?
Well, Jefferson forms a Twin Bridges.
Yeah.
Jefferson.
Yeah.
Yes. And so you have to travel all the way up to that junction of the Beaverhead and the Ruby, and that's where impacts to Bozeman are currently mostly mitigated at. And there's a gray area there for me as well of where all the rivers come in and converge. And that's why when we talk about local, mitigating at a local scale, it's something we have talked about in the council for years before, because our service areas that were set up 25 years ago are very large. And, we do see impacts that are mitigated in other watersheds. We had impacts from the airport in Hamilton, I believe, being mitigated for in the Blackfoot watershed. So pretty distant. And so this idea of local mitigation banks, especially in rapidly developing areas, is and should be a big topic and something that we are looking at and considering more. And this bank effort was locally driven, which makes it really nice. Not MDT. Well, MDT does have a local bank there, but not mitigation bankers, not in lieu fee. So this was a local group, and our first sort of local group that's not our in lieu fee program or our mitigation banker.
I was just going to clarify that Hamilton Airport impacts were actually mitigated for about 6 miles away at the Teller Wildlife Refuge.
Some stream credits went Nevada Spring and wet credits.
Not sure.
I thought that we were doing that. But anyways.
Can we kind of have this as one of our discussion topics, in a future, at the